Hello, everyone. It is Professor Hamamoto here for you. It is December 3rd, year 2023, and the time is 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Welcome, one and all. Today, we're going to have a very special presentation. I've been busily preparing for it over the past few weeks, doing some reading. And in particular, I'm going to be relying on this fairly new book. I think it was published this year, 2023, titled Solid State. That's the overriding metaphor for ironically, the dissolution, the ungluing, the uncoming together of the Beatles. On one level, and on another level, the metaphor has to do with, quite literally, the switch over from one set of electronic technologies to another. And I'm going to try to integrate that without completely nerding out today. In this talk here, I'll deal with some of the technology, not too deeply, but just so you get an idea of all the different vectors that go into making what has proven to be great art after over 50 years now. And the subtitle is The Story of Abbey Road and the End of the Beatles, hence the title today. And it's by Kenneth Womack, Professor Kenneth Womack. I'll give you his bona fides in a moment. He also, I wouldn't call it a companion book, but he also did a book, which I'm in the process of reading right now, on Super Roadie. I don't know how to describe him otherwise. Mal Evans. Yeah, a huge book, and that's an original piece of research. A lot of this material here, if you've been reading Beatles biographies and autobiographies and commentary, and there's tons of work on it, encyclopedias, reference books, and whatever, you'll remember a lot of stories here. So there's not a lot of primary research involved in this book, but in the Mal Evans book, there seems to be. It comes from his papers, his own writings, and anyway, hopefully I'll be able to get to this. It's a really thick book. Maybe I'll be able to do it next week. I don't know. I can't promise. But today we're going to be reintroducing the Beatles, playing on you remember the classic album, at least the American version, Meet the Beatles, right? And I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's not 2023. It came out in 2019. So I'm behind, right? Anybody who claims to be current on the Beatle bibliography, which keeps growing and growing, and the discography, which keeps growing and growing, which I'll get to in a moment, because Abbey Road has even been remastered a couple times. The most recent time, I believe, and again, if I'm mistaken, feel free to comment down below. I think the most recent remastering was by Giles Martin, who is the son, as most of you knew already, the son of the great Sir George Martin, who comes off very, very nicely, very well in this book, and justifiably so, I would say. And I'd have to say maybe Womack is prejudiced towards him in a good way, because he did a 2-volume biography of George Martin, which I haven't read yet. I haven't read a lot of the material. I read it since I was a kid, coming out. Hunter Davies and some early material on the individual Beatles, especially John Lennon. Good, Bad, and Ugly. And let's see. He's also, let me give you his background, the author here, so you get an idea how dedicated he is to his craft. By the way, this is published by Cornell University Press. Now, I wouldn't call it an academic book, but it is published by a reputable firm attached to a university, which tells me that studying the Beatles and popular culture in general has become academically respectable. And as I've addressed the topic once, more than once before, I have a background in being a proselytizer for popular culture studies way back since 1976, when I worked toward a master's degree in popular culture at Bowling Green State University, Ohio. So the generational shift has taken over the academia, and it's not such a big hurdle to overcome. And the reason I mention this is because there are all these typically institutional barriers that these artists and intellectuals and people who are interested in creativity have to overcome. And one of them is the stories that the Beatles had to overcome in the studio. Now, the reason why they were able to get their artistic agenda across is because they were making money for the parent company, right? EMI and Capitol Records and Parlophone and all the way down the line there. So let me continue here. By the way, the book is dedicated, justifiably so. He passed away not long ago. Jeff Emmerich, the really important the engineer, one of the primary engineers, if not the principal engineer of the Beatles records, especially their highly innovative ones, including Abbey Road, which was, as most of you already know, and I apologize if you've already assimilated this information here. Abbey Road is the last recorded album, even though Let It Be was released after that, as you know. So Abbey Road, 1969. And this book here is dedicated to the great Jeff Emmerich. Now, Emmerich himself has a autobiography. It's excellent. It's called Here, There, and Everywhere, published in 2006. And you also might want to check out the book by George Martin, which is titled All You Need Is Ears. And he lived to age 90. So this book came out in 1979. I read both of those, right? Like I say, I'm behind on the more current literature. I'm catching up, but these are two seminal books that you might want to check out as well. And you don't necessarily even have to be a Beatle nerd to appreciate these histories here. These are cultural histories. There's a little bit of political history. There's all kinds of technical information if you're so inclined. And we're going to get into that in a moment, as I've said. Okay, but before we launch into the discussion here, I'll give you a couple more bits of information about Jeff Emmerich. He is the Dean of Humanities. Wow, he's got a administrative position in academia, Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at Monmouth University, and he is a professor of English. And I believe I've seen some of his pieces on YouTube, especially in talking about his books in particular. I believe he does play music himself. I think he's in a band but he can and the reason I mention is because he can understand like a lot of authors do not. He can kind of understand the music from the inside out. Even then, there are some limitations to his comprehension, and they're not his fault as such. The limitations of the book, the size and the scope of it, and I hope to fill in some of the gaps there. So a lot of I'm just giving you this caveat here. A lot of the material that I'm presenting here in this talk is not necessarily that of Mr. Womack, Professor Womack. He might not share the same perceptions. And I'm not going to be very good in distinguishing what's his idea and opinion or observation and mine. I'm going to be fairly free in interjecting my own observations. But by and large, it's a good book. I give it 5 stars, a recommended reading. And hopefully this is a presage, an indication of even greater works to come. Hey, there's Kathy Sue, a familiar name there. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Kathy. I'm glad to see that there's so much activity in the chat room here, but I'm going to try to stay on track here because, as you can imagine, this is a huge, a deep topic. The Beatles. There are whole channels dedicated just to the Beatles, right? So, to finish up with Professor Womack, he's compiled to show you the scope of his expertise. He compiled the Beatles Encyclopedia, and again, I will admit I don't have that in my library. I have all kinds of reference books for different topics, but I do not have the Beatles Encyclopedia, and it's not the only reference book, by the way. There's one that talks about the Beatles instruments only, which I do have. I think is it John McDermott? I'm not really sure. I have tons of them. One of these days, I'm going to go into my storage unit and pluck out all the Beatles related books and, you know, set them aside and donate them. Who knows? But that's part of the fun of Beatlesology. So the book, getting into the book proper, is really about the unsolid state, the coming undone, the dissolution of the unraveling of the Beatles, right? And they had less than a decade together, something like 9 years of producing incredible material. I don't need to sing their praises. Most of you know or are already convinced of their individual and collective genius, and we'll get into some specifics in a moment, including showcasing Ringo's one and only drum solo in the whole oeuvre of the Beatles' works. As you know, famously, Ringo hated drum solos, and they really had the rest of the other Beatles. They really had to put pressure on him for fun, in a good humored way. Put pressure on Ringo to do that drum on the end, which is part of the Abbey Road medley, which Professor Womack goes through the meddling, the process, and the thinking behind it, and the practical problems that they encountered in bringing together these disparate elements of half-finished or incomplete songs and putting them and synthesizing them into what seems like it is an organic medley. And it's not just a matter of splicing them together either. It requires a great deal of conceptual coherence and musical compatibility in keys and rhythms and time signatures and all the different elements that we can go on and on about, and people have. Right? I do have a few DVDs and a couple of books that are dedicated specifically to the musicological aspects of the Beatles, right down to the type of modes that they preferred. Music theory, hardcore music theory. So you can see that the task of trying to even talk about the Beatles casually is a daunting one at minimum. So, as I stated, it's kind of a bittersweet metaphor, solid state, right? Because they are in a process of liquefaction, if you will. But also, um, it's the argument of Womack, and I don't know if I really am convinced of the demarcation line. Well, I know it changed their sound when the Beatles went from an analog system of recording. Now I'm starting to nerd out, so I'll try to keep it to a minimum. When it went from an analog system, just roughly speaking, to a digital one, right? And yeah, it made their music sound different, but it also gave them uh, capabilities that were before the Beatles really, I mean, as a major group, were really unknown. They were down to, they were doing mono records when they first started on this old, it's called Red, REDD, I think model number 47. All valve in England is called valve. In Britain, they're called valves. In the United States, we call them tubes. So that's analog, right? And they generate a lot of heat, and there's reliability problems. But it was all built to mil spec, military specifications, these types of, because they're all bespoke, they're all custom made recording equipment, recording console, right? And we'll see one in a moment, just to give you an idea, because it's hard to really capture that in the words alone. So this is something that I can contribute to Professor Womack's study. And then they went from that during the recording of Abbey Road to a digital disc, the famed EMI TG12345. That's really easy to remember, right? EMI, of course, is the parent company. They um, did not only music, but they did R&D in all kinds of different areas. And I think they were heavily involved in British military research, that helped them win World War One and Two, right? World War Three with the Beatles, sonic warfare. Who knows? But that's EMI, and so there's the transition. So that's Professor Womack's dividing line. So rather than keep it in the abstract realm, let's take a look at some of this hardware, okay? And let's add this to the image. Just a short piece right here. And believe me, there's tons of people out there who make it their business, literally. I mean, it is their business, not just their hobby, to talk about, discuss, and now create what's called plugins for you, because you can do a lot of this recording now that the Beatles pioneered. You can do it in your own computer. The one I'm speaking to you or communicating with you right now, my Mac Pro book, you can record albums on that now, and people do. It's called recording in the box, but originally it was done out in the analog and then the digital domain externally in studios like Abbey Road, which you all know is the name. It's the formal name of what used to be called EMI Studios. So let's take a look at this early piece of hardware, the one that the Beatles recorded all their early hits back in, late 63 to 64.
TG12345 console. In 1968, the introduction of 8-track recording and increasing sonic experimentation by the Beatles and other groundbreaking artists meant that the capabilities of Abbey Road's Red 37 and Red 51 consoles were being stretched. To meet these growing needs, the EMI TG12345 desk was built and designed by both the Abbey Road technical engineers and the central research laboratories at the EMI Hayes factories. The prototype consoles were installed in the Abbey Road experimental room in the summer of 1968 to give the recording engineers time to get used to the workflow before being installed in the studios. Compared to the all-valve red desks, the transistor-based TG desk gave a smoother and mellower sound. Did you know the Beatles' last recorded album, Abbey Road, was recorded on the desk, as well as several solo Beatles records and singles, such as John Lennon's Instant Karma, Ringo's Sentimental Journey, Paul McCartney's Maybe I'm Amazed and Every Night, and George Harrison's classic All Things Must Pass. In 2014, Waves Audio and Abbey Road Studios created the EMI TG12345 channel strip plugin. Thanks to meticulous component modeling, it captures every celebrated feature of the original console. This includes the input mic preamp, the harmonic distortion, the bass and treble EQ bands from the mic cassette, and the console's famous compressors and limiters. Like and follow for more.
Okay, what they're referring to is the plugins that now have been recreated digitally, and I'm sure there are purists that say no, it's not going to be the same, and good on them if they want to preserve all the quirks and the uniqueness of the analog and the digital past, right? The discs and stuff. I learned in researching or preparing for this specific talk that EMI desk was bought by an American who lives not far from here in Oakland, and it almost went down. There was an Oakland Hills fire. I don't know, 20 years ago. So I can't remember exactly. I'm really poor on these dates. The Oakland Hills that overlook UC Berkeley. It's kind of a ritzy area, by the way. And from the hills, you can see across the bay, the San Francisco Bay. You can see San Francisco. And he was there because an American, which I'll show you in a moment, bought it, and then eventually he had to sell it because it's it belongs to the world really. But from what I recount or understand, I might be wrong, and again, correct me. It might have changed hands, this recording console, but the last I heard, it was in the under private ownership of the rock musician Lenny Kravitz. So here's the story about that particular piece of hardware, just to finish this line of inquiry here for the nerds.
I'm a lifelong musician in the San Francisco Bay Area, singer-songwriter, performed with lots of different bands, and All that music comes from seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. So I fell in love with music and the Beatles the same day. In late 1980, early 1981, I got a call from an old bandmate of mine who had gone from playing guitar to buying and selling vintage gear. As Dan was having breakfast in Soest, West Germany, he's reading a newspaper and scanning one ad, and in it was an ad for a 4-Trekken recording console. The phone rang in my house in Oakland, California. I picked it up and he said, "Hey Chris, it's Dan." And he said, "Do you want to buy the Beatle board?" And I said, "Say that again?" And he said, "You want to buy the Beatle board?" And pretty much without hesitation, I said, "Yeah." This console arrived in San Francisco in '81 on 5 pallets. It splits into 5 modules. There's the 2 lower, 2 upper, and this middle module, and installed it in a bedroom. It lived there for roughly 10, 12 years. One of the qualifications for the deal was that my friend Dan knew that I loved the Beatles, and he said, "At some point you're going to have to sell it." The keepers of the console moved from my hands to Lenny Kravitz and has been in his hands ever since.
I remember walking into the control room. This was sitting just in the corner, and Henry, first thing he said out of his mouth is, "Welcome to 1960." And I do remember that first walking in, how hot the room was, just because there was so much tube gear.
It is sort of the last iteration of tube or valve consoles. It's the highest form of it, and it was not made to be mass produced, so it was made with the highest quality in mind at every step of the way. It's like a precision machine, and it's like an old piece of military gear. It's really sturdy. REDD, Recording Engineering Development Division, made the Red 37. It turns out it was an offshoot of the Red 17. It was the next generation. The Red 17 was the first console that EMI made in roughly 1955. And the evolution came to this Red 37. There was a prototype, and then there were 2 of these Red 37s made. This one, it was used to record the Beatles right up to about 64, the first record and a few things. And also Let It Be. 4-track recording was just becoming the name of the game. So it has 8 inputs and 4 outputs. It's an 8-in, 4-out console. It's very simple, and it's very to the point. There's a treble control and a bass control, and it has a plus and minus configuration. Each pair of channels shares a module that dictates the frequency responses that are where the treble cuts and subtracts, and where the bass.
Okay, he gets into the more technical aspects of the recording console. In Britain, they're called desks. In the US, they refer to it as a recording board, but a console is what the manufacturers call it. So thanks to these people who have an appreciation of the history and the historical importance of these cherished piece of instruments, they're keeping the legacy alive without government support. Hey, how about that? Right? We don't need the government, right? EMI was quasi-governmental. There was a Sir so-and-so who ran the books and all that. It was very much wed to the British military financial City of London establishment. And that's where the Beatles conspiracy theories start to generate, right? They don't give the Beatles credit for their own artistry, ingenuity, and their own status as outsiders from the north, from Liverpool, and say, "Oh yeah, the Beatles were synthetic and they were a CIA and an MI6 construct." Maybe they cynically were used in a certain fashion, but themselves and the group and the music, there's no hint of it that I could detect myself or in any of the literature there. And I mentioned this in passing because no doubt some knucklehead who knows nothing about the Beatles, who's listened to 0 of it, but have read some of these dickheads who have popped up on YouTube or whatever, and the Paul is dead group and all that. So go ahead and make your stupid comments. We'll just blithely ignore your idiocy. Um, so to, and these talented individuals in the group itself does not need any apologetics from me. I mean, their artistry, if anybody cares to really probe it, or even look at it superficially, can see the genius of it. And to that point, um, as I mentioned before, the author, Professor Womack, uh, holds George Martin justifiably in high esteem. And so to underscore that point, I wanted to show you a clip where George Martin comes to LA, in Los Angeles, which he says is the capital of entertainment, not just music, but movies and now new media. And I think LA, or Hollywood, quote unquote, might still wear the crown, although some of the centers have changed and have shifted around the world. But anyway, he comes in there and does check out the scene there, and he meets this time with the one and only Brian Wilson. Do I need to explain who that is? He's the creative genius, the force behind songwriting force behind the Beach Boys, who are from Los Angeles, Hawthorne, California, South Bay, and you probably know the basics of their history. So I will not tread across that terrain at this point. But what I want to show you here with this clip, and hopefully this is all to amplify, not to negate anything that Professor Womack's saying here, but when we talk about the boards, the mixing console, and all that, I feel that's important for you to get a visual and it's sort of an idea that doesn't come across in just writing, because he does spend a lot of time. And I appreciate that with the technology behind the recording, right? It's crucial, and it's something that's I guess I consider myself obsessive, I'm in trying to find this information out. And that's what these people are. They are obsessed, in their but in their case, like Brian Wilson, they have a gift. It's a gift from God. It comes from the heart. It comes from the soul. And this is what Brian Wilson is telling George Martin. But it's very interesting that outside, and this is why I'm showing you the clip, outside his acquaintance, not just acquaintance, but his instrumental role, no pun intended, or pun intended, because he played about almost 50 Beatles songs, contributed as a musician, not a studio musician. He wasn't under contract for that, but he did play. He performed most of the keyboard parts on close to 50 different Beatles. There's a YouTube on that if you want to check it out. But outside his working relationship with the Beatles, shall I say, but dealing with Brian Wilson, he's remixing a classic tune that you'll notice or recognize, rather, God Only Knows, which is one of I think it was Paul McCartney said that's one of his, number one favorite all-time songs. And it is beautiful. It's a ballad, heartfelt. It comes from God. And there was some discussion whether they could release it as a single because it had the word God and had the concept of God in a pop tune. So, but it broke a lot of rules in many other respects. All right. But George Martin sits down there and he's remixing, and he gets the ultimate compliment from Brian Wilson, who says, George, this mix you did, and he did the same service for the Beatles and other groups, by the way, which we don't have time to talk about, but he performed the same professional service to the Beatles that is appreciated by everybody, including the great Brian Wilson. So let's, with no further ado, take a look at that.
Like your heart writes the music, your brain, you can see these keys and you can relate to how the different chords relate to each other. But I think the real music being made comes from your heart. Yeah.
I may not always love you, as long as there are stars above you.
God Only Knows has always been one of my favorite Beach Boys songs.
I'll make you so sure about it, and God only knows what I'd be without you.
Excuse me, you must have had a kind of blueprint in your mind before you went in the studio. What you were going to
Arrangement wise, but not sound wise.
Right.
I couldn't think in my head before I got to what it would sound like. till I got there.
No, sure, but that will come with the studio work. But
Yeah.
you must have had the plan there of all the
There
harmonies
was there, yeah, absolutely.
working
yeah.
in. It's a lovely.
The real music being made comes from your heart.
Always love you.
Sorry. I mean, I could listen to that over and over again, but yeah, to impress Brian Wilson is something, but that's the level of respect that George Martin had realized by the time the Beatles had come apart, and yeah, he deserves all the recognition and more. He was later knighted, by the way. He's called Sir George Martin, and his son took on the mantle now. If we have some time, I'll show you a clip that features his son Giles Martin, who, as I alluded to earlier, remastered for the 50th anniversary of Abbey Road, the album, released it on CD, of course. I think it maybe vinyl as well, but definitely the CD version was his doing. And this is not in the book here. You can check this out on your own. He also did a show that wound up in Las Vegas in a recording, and it's called Love. Right? Let me see what year that was done. I don't have the notes right at my fingertips here, but it was done quite a number of years ago. Let's see. Anyway, it's still in print. You can find it, but he takes a number of different Beatles songs. Some of them, most of them you'll recognize, with some of the more obscure ones, and patches them together. And patching is not really a good term because there's artistry in and of itself in melding together. And for a short while, I didn't get to see it, but there was a show with the high-end audio equipment in Las Vegas they had. I'd like to see a revival of Love and have it broadcast in a theatrical setting. I have a CD, of course, to listen to it, and it stands alone on its own as a piece of work that's been it's more than a remix. It's a radical rethinking of the Beatles' work. So that's Giles Martin. We might get to him before we finish here. Now, since we're on the Beach Boys, what I'm thinking is that, and I know this to be true because I read it in other sources, not in Womack's book, but there was an informal rivalry between the Beatles and the Beach Boys. The Beatles, Lennon and McCartney, and I'm sure George Harrison to a large extent, were very much impressed by Pet Sounds coming from Brian Wilson. As you know, he came off the road. The rest of the Beach Boys kept touring, but he stayed home so he could work on his music, do his writing, and serve as the creative engine for the rest of the group. So Pet Sounds made a huge impact there. And then the Beatles, competitive as they are, because Lennon and McCartney wanted to be known as songwriters as well. It's not just the Beatles, the teen idols, the performers. And as you know, they quit performing live and they said, this is madness. We don't want to be mauled by these teenagers who can't even hear us perform. And we're going to just devote ourselves to the studio and the songwriting, which makes someone like Brian Epstein less important because he was the guy that's booking the live performances. And Epstein is dealt with or treated, he's written about a little bit in the book here, but there are separate studies on him. One on the Velvet Mafia, I think it's called. It's about all the gays that ran the British music industry, the managers and the Sir Reginald Who, Whiffle Snows or whatever. And I mention this because that's the nature of the entertainment business. All right. So when you talk about GLBTQ, you're talking about a redundancy. You're like queer rights. Come on, like representation. It's already there, right? David Geffen, what more do you want? You've got your name on everything. The UCLA Medical Center. You gave $150 million to the Yale School of Drama. Now it's the David Geffen School of Drama. You also invested in DEN, Digital Entertainment Network, right? Probably stands for Den of Iniquity, which was a kind of a gay-centric content type and I just mentioned this because that's some of the politics that Womack does not get into, which is not his fault. It's just maybe he doesn't feel it's important. And there are separate studies if you want to go down that route, as I'm indicating here. But Brian Wilson, the informal rivalry between the groups, it shows up creatively on Abbey Road because almost every single track, especially on side two, I'm talking about albums now, right? CDs, there's no side. There's 1 and 2, but it came out in vinyl. It was side 1, side 2. Side 2 for Abbey Road to me is where the album really, that's the strength of it, right? Come Together, something is kind of nice, and Come Together is a ripoff, as you know, of You Can't Catch Me by Chuck Berry. It's slowed down, and the Beatles knew it, especially Paul said, "Hey, that's Chuck Berry," and they later got sued, and the Beatles lost, John Lennon lost, which is another story altogether. But the album really starts on side 2, and that's where the Beach Boys influence really shows up, I think, in the backup vocals, the harmonies, right? The Beatles were known, I think, by the Rolling Stones as the three-headed monster, right? Because they had 3 harmony voices, where the Stones had 1, maybe 2 at best, but they were mostly, most pop groups were like that. But the Beatles, I think, listened to and absorbed and implemented what they learned from the Beach Boys, who, as you know, through Brian Wilson, patterned themselves out of the great 50s and early 60s vocal groups like the Four Freshmen and the Letterman. Over, I think they were in Capitol Records, and that was the the Beach Boys label as well, Capitol, right? And the story goes that Brian Wilson, getting the deal, he was kind of auditioning his talents and could sing all the different parts, the 4 parts of the harmony, and he taught his brothers how to do that in the group, and it shows up, like in the song "God Only Knows." Just listen to some of even the real teeny bopper songs, those really beautiful harmonies that Brian Wilson learned, absorbed, and the Beatles took that. And I studiously avoided listening to the album before this talk here, but I could not resist just before going on here listening to the entire album, focusing on side 2. I'm talking about Abbey Road. And I'm listening to all the different tracks from Here Comes the Sun, which is a George Harrison tune, by the way. By that time, George Harrison had established himself, not, I would say, as the equal, but at least he good enough to where that song, Here Comes the Sun, could lead off side 2. It would be strong. And I mention this because he was disgruntled. George, as you know, you saw the documentary by Peter Jackson, right? And you've read the books, and he wanted to get his own material out, but by that time, Lennon and McCartney already had a lock on it, because they were really the founders of the group. George kind of came in later, and but he matured as a songwriter and became his own man artistically, right? So Here Comes the Sun, great backup vocals. It's all the Beatles except for Ringo. Ringo would do solo tunes like Octopus's Garden and whatnot, but I don't think he ever harmonized. But you got George, Paul, and John there doing these meticulously notated arrangements. They're head arrangements, but I think George Martin probably taught it to them. He had formal training, George Martin, Guildhall music, and he had aspirations of being a composer himself. So he could teach the Beatles he can get the theoretical aspects of functional harmony and bring it down to earth and make it work in the studio, to put it lightly, right? So listen to that, which is the second track on side 2. Listen to the vocals; it's very Beach Boy like, the close harmonies. There's some harpsichord here, and then Womack talks about how they record a lot of in the studio, a lot of these effects by using vari speed, right? This is technical information that most people don't care about, but I do. And there's the first, not the first, but among the early use of the Moog synthesizer. It's spelled M-O-O-G, but it's pronounced Moog, as in Bob Moog. He's from the East Coast, and then there's a West Coast sound. There's East Coast versus West Coast. The West Coast sound is like Don Buchla, people like that, and Roger Lynn, and there's two different schools. But the Moog was the first one to really kind of hit the commercial market. And Professor Womack talks about how I think it was George Harrison who acquired a Moog synthesizer, and it came with no instructions. It's just a lot of inputs there and the patch cords that go nowhere or everywhere. And he was patient with them. They got some sounds out, but they did not overdo it. It's like opening up a new jar of mustard. You put too much on the sandwich, right? Because it's new. But they made sure they didn't overdo it. So they used the Moog synthesizer because it's very subtle. You might even not remember it. You Never Give Me Your Money, piano, very simple introduction. It's pure McCartney. And I think by that time he was playing regularly his Rickenbacker bass. He traded in his Hofner bass, and you have these loping melodic bass lines showing up and well recorded on the new recording console, right? You could hear the bass really nicely define the nice mid-range. It became less thumpy, right? In the early Beatles records here, you can hear the lines. You have to listen to it, but they're more tuba-like. They're more string bass-like. That's where the Hofner German-made bass really came in. Sounded like a stand-up bass more than a Rickenbacker, which is a more mid-range, upper mid-range song, and it's easier to play. The neck is really thin. I don't have one. I do have a Rickenbacker 360 12-string like George had. Of course I had to get it. It's 1960 specs. That's mine. It's not a vintage. It's a reissue, which is another example of their experimentation. The 12-string guitar. They didn't use a lot of 12-string on as if I can remember, Abbey Road, but they used a lot in Revolver, Rubber Soul, and the Byrds made it part of their signature song. And again, You Never Give Me Your Money, great vocal harmonies like Brian Wilson's Beach Boys, right? And what's interesting about that tune, You Never Give Me Your Money, it's a series of songs that were half realized by Lennon and McCartney mostly, and there's some boogie woogie stuff in there, right? In part 2 of You Never Give Me Your Money. These are just notes I scrawled shortly before coming on air here, and I think it's George. Again, if you're a Beatle nerd, correct me if I'm wrong. You Never Give Me Your Money. There's some really great chimey, I don't know how else to describe it, chimey double stops that George used. That comes from a lot of country music, plays these 6 intervals, not fourths, right? That would be more blues, more Hendrixy, but they use a lot of 6 intervals. But he was able to get some interesting sounds. And that's where people like this fellow, Ken Townsend, comes into very handy. He manages to get these unique sounds. I won't let him talk that much, but I'll just show you who Ken Townsend was, what he looks like, because he's mentioned in this book. He's important. All right, and we'll finish up there in a moment. Here we go.
My name's Ken Townsend, and I used to work here. Well, some people said I worked here. I was here from 1950 when I joined EMI at Hayes, and I left here at the end of 1995. So it's quite a long stint, really. So I've got quite a bit of experience of what happened at Abbey Road over the years. So if you want to hear some of it, maybe now I might tell you. I went to school at Borlase at Marlow, which is a grammar school, and finished up with loads of A-levels. And at that time, because of national service, one never quite knew what you could do next. But I applied for a job at EMI at Hayes as a design and development engineer trainee. I went to in October 1950, and I was accepted and started there on November the 1st, 1950, which incidentally is exactly the same day as George Martin started at EMI, But he started here in Abbey Road at the Frontier, room 41, as assistants to on the parlophone label. Anyway, my time at Hayes.
Okay, you can watch it on your own time there if you're interested. But I felt that he should get some FaceTime on my show here, my little talk. But yeah, he was there since 1950, and there was really no quote unquote rock and roll at that time. They were doing most probably almost exclusively classical or light classical, maybe some novelty. Because George Martin started in 1950, as you heard too, and he started out with one of their secondary, tertiary at EMI with a label called Parlophone. You probably know this already, and he was very much working with sound effects and different audio experiments that later found their way to the Beatles. He was in 1950, the Beatles. He didn't really get with them until 62, 63, around that time. So he had been with, he was a veteran at Abbey Roads or EMI Studios by the time the Beatles came along. And of course, he made his reputation recording comedy skits with late radio, early television with the Goon Show, Spike Milligan, right, which is a comedic icon in Britain. And the Beatles, of course, adopted a lot of the Spike Milligan Goon humor. And by the way, Peter Sellers, who I gave a talk on maybe last year or the year before, the actor Peter Sellers, right? Not the male prostitute Peter Sellers. That's a joke. He was a member of the Goon Show, right? That's where he came from until he branched off his own, became an incredibly great comedic actor, starting in some of the early low-budget post-war British films, and then of course Hollywood got him in there, and he played. Stanley Kubrick realized what a great performer he was, put him in Doctor Strangelove. He played not one, but three different roles. Okay, so the Beatles and George Martin and that whole milieu are kind of related in a way. And that's why over 50 years later, the Beatles still matter. Not that I really even have to justify that with anybody. But I just want to underscore that point here. Man, I'd love to teach a class in the Beatles or popular music. I've done one in popular music, but not exclusively on one group. And there's a lot of material now that I can draw on, and my own insights, I think, that could be brought into such a course or curriculum. And then there's the Sun King. And according to Professor Womack, they were influenced, the Beatles were influenced by a song by Fleetwood Mac called Albatross. Now, this is not the Fleetwood Mac of Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. This was the Fleetwood Mac when they were more blues based. They were kind of like John. In fact, they had a connection. John McVie used to be with the John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and Peter Green was with Fleetwood Mac. I don't want to get too far afield in pop history or rock or blues history, but I think that's a Peter Green composition. He later went off his rocker, Peter Green. There's a story behind that. He came back though, by the way, Peter Green. And they did this kind of a spacey song called Albatross, and apparently the Beatles liked it and copped its vibe, as it said, for the song Sun King. So far as my observations are concerned, like many people, I observed that this is when the Paul McCartney's bass became more melodic and more lyrical. Again, I think it's because of the use of the Rickenbacker 4001S bass, the long, slender neck, and the pickups and the construction made it accentuate the more high-end, upper mid-range tones, which he exploited by weaving these little lines through the song. And then also sonically, we're talking about, and Professor Womack does mention it more than once, It's kind of redundant. In a couple of places, an editor missed it. He kept talking about George Harrison's Leslie speaker sound, right? We know that he used it on Badge with the last album that Cream did. That sort of arpeggio, and I don't know where he got it from. I think the story is he got it from somebody in the U.S. The Leslie speaker, if you don't know, is a giant cabinet with a rotor on the bottom and a speaker that kind of diffuses the sound around there mechanically. It's a mechanical device that organists would attach it to their Hammond B3 organ. And it gives it a really nice, full, spacey sound. And Harrison applied it to guitar. And I think that's really one of the first uses. I think Jesse Ed Davis, who George Harrison really liked as a guitarist, he's an American Indian. Jesse Ed Davis used some Leslie speaking. Maybe you got it from Jesse Ed Davis. Anyway, these are topics that nerds can and do explore on and on and on. But the Leslie vibrato, it's called modulation, vibrato, tremolo, shows up. You can get pedals now. You can get plugins now. You don't need the giant wooden cabinet anymore. That's how important sonically the Beatles were in influencing subsequent popular music down to this day. And I have tons of pedals. I don't know about how many. I have dozens of them. Amongst them, pedals that purportedly are supposed to sound just like a Leslie speaker. They don't. They don't sound. I mean, they get close, but you can tell it's not really there. But it's an approximation. And again, some beautiful Sun King. Oh, the harmonies, 3-part harmonies here. George Martin, the Beatles, Paul, John, George. They got behind the microphone and just came up with some really smooth harmonies. Yeah, there's some macaroni. It's called macaroni when John Lennon makes these fake Italian lyrics. Quando para mucho, tanta muche, carousel, all that stuff, right? And I used to tease my friend Luigi Ferrari, and called him Louis, who was a Sicilian, was singing that because I knew all the words, right? And I said, "What does that mean, Louis?" And he said, "This is nothing. It's just a bunch of gibberish." I thought it was real Italian, because I didn't know the language. So he tried to get me to sing that in front of his parents, who were, immigrants from Italy. The Italian was their first language. And so, but I didn't do it. I didn't want to insult them, But anyway, little touches like that. John Lennon could pull it off because he said, "I'm going to do this." And "Mean Mr. Bustard" is the next song. I listened to it again this time around, again for preparation in this talk here, and it's amazing. His lyrics are really in itself. There's these internal rhymes. He is a writer in his own right. That was one of his books. And of course, people have noticed before, but he used a lot of time signature changes. That's one of the reasons why the Beatles were so enrapturing, I guess, because it wasn't just like you hear today in a lot of pop music. It's called 4 on the floor, right? Boom, boom, was a bass drum or a bass or both. It's saying going boom, 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 boom. That's 4 on the floor. But the Beatles used time shifts, signatures, rubato, and you could do that when you're in the analog mode, right? If you're doing multi-track like they do today, you can just stack all this junk on there and it starts sounding like 4 on the floor garbage, right? So check out Lennon on this stuff here. Even though he's a rocker, he likes to play in 4/4 time, sometimes 6/8. His own compositions had these complex time signatures, and Ringo kept up with him. That's amazing, which we'll get to in a moment. Polythene Pam, kind of a rocker, again, another Lennon rocker, but again, check out the vocal harmonies, pure Beach Boys. Okay, this is where and listen to Ringo's tom-toms, the way they're tuned and the way that they're recorded by Jeff Emmerich and the other assistant engineers. I don't know who did the guitar solo. So one of you Beatle experts can tell me there. Um, and then I'll be done in a moment. We're going to see some examples. So hang on, because we're almost done here. If I want to finish in an hour. She came in through the bathroom window, based on a true story of Beatles fans, Apple scruffs, who tried to steal stuff from McCartney, came in through his bathroom window. There's that George Harrison chimey guitar again, using those country music intervals and the fills. I think that's George Harrison. Again, the vocal backing is incredible, and Ringo's drumming is incredible, because there's a lot of those Lennon-esque time shifts, and Ringo's keeping up with it. I mean, it must have been wild trying to come up with these parts and trying to describe, Lennon describing what he wants to hear, but Ringo can pick it up very, very quickly. I think a lot of that was shown in Peter Jackson's film on the Beatles, right? Which I gave a talk on with my childhood friend, Howard Wilson, months ago. So check that out. Check out the Peter Jackson documentary. You have it. And there's another group, I think, that influenced the Beatles, and they had some relationship to them. But I think their vocals were highly influential towards the Beatles. They started to focus on them more in the studio, and that would be the Hollies, right? And the Hollies, of course, that's where Graham Nash comes out of. He had that high tenor voice, and they again had those really nice 3-part harmonies. Listen to their hit singles. I think the Beatles were listening as well. And one of the engineers one of the part of the Beatles retinue is given credit for having discovered the Hollies and bringing them in. So there's all these different cross influences that are taking place. And then getting back to George Martin, Carry That Weight, the orchestration, the strings. Like I said, he was trained as a composer, orchestrator, arranger, and it shows up the strings there. And by this time, by Abbey Road, they had the budget that they requested, because they were earning tons of money for the parent company. And of course, in the Carry That Weight, there's a reprise of You Never Give Me Your Money. So it becomes operatic. It becomes like a suite where you have, you return to an earlier theme and you weave it in there. That's part of the medley. And that's what makes side 2 of Abbey Road the artistic triumph that it is known as today. And then at the end, it's called The End, and that I appropriated part of The End as the title of this talk. The End, that's where Ringo has his one and only drum solo. So ladies and gentlemen, for your delectation, I found a person, because I'm not the only individual who understands and appreciates Ringo's one and only solo. There's tons of people out there that are all drummers. For our edification, we will see the drum solo. Check it out. Now, my favorite part is not even the drum solo itself, but the close and open hi-hat and snare drum sound right after the solo, where he gets back into the beat. He solos, and then he hits the hi-hat with the open, and he shuts it, and it chokes it. And they've got a great, really nice snare sound, and they put a T cloth over the snare drum to mute it a little bit, but it still comes through. It still cuts. So here's a I don't know who he is. I thank you for doing this, whoever you are. But this is the extent of Beatles obsession that a lot of us share. So check it out, listen carefully, and try to find it yourself on TubeView. Yes, nice tom-tom works. The tom-toms are those 3 drums on the top. You can rerun it and watch it yourself, and you can hear the bass drum doing 4 on the floor, and then he ends after the solo's over, he gets into that funky pattern that became very popular in American, black music in particular, right? That hi-hat, that choked hi-hat sound with the snare. So there you go, and also to go on with the, isolation of some of these parts that are bigger than the whole. For our edification, we're going to take a look at the guitar solo medley. This is the only time that I'm aware of that the Beatles did this, but they alternated solo, they traded solo. Now this is really common practice in the jazz world, right? You got Miles Davis taking the first few choruses, and then you got Coltrane doing the next couple choruses, and then you got McCoy Tyner, doing the next ones. It's they just switch and then they return to the theme. But here, and the story goes, and this is something new that I learned from Professor Womack's book, is that they wanted a guitar solo, but they didn't, know how they were going to approach it. And John Lennon just piped up and says, "Well, let me do it. Why can't I solo?" And John Lennon, as great of a rhythm guitarist he was, he started out in banjo, so he has kind of a banjo, this technique, frailing technique, kind of. Um, and they said, "Oh, okay, let's do that." And then they decided, well, why don't we just do like in the jazz world, they just trade fours, or I don't know how many bars are in there. And people who are really up on it can tell me which order it was. I think the first one was John. You can kind of tell their styles. And John, as you know, Lennon wasn't really known for his lead guitar. Rhythm, yes. All My Lovin', listen to the rhythm part. That's John Lennon. He's doing these double rhythm strokes. That's from the banjo technique. Yeah, that's pure Lennon. But he wasn't really known as a lead guitarist. The person that really started to latch on to the big guitar virtuosity scare in the 60s was George Harrison, and his guitar solos here, you can tell because he was hanging out a lot with Eric Clapton. So there are a lot of Clapton-isms that got into his work, the bends and the stain, even the tone. And I think Clapton had given George a Les Paul, a Gibson Les Paul, that got him that Clapton his tone originally with he had an SG Les Paul. He played Gibsons at that time before he went to Strat. I'm talking about Clapton here, but the point is that they hung out together, and I think George absorbed some of that. And then Paul McCartney's guitar playing is interesting. It's very primitive. I like it. His drumming is primitive. You got to hear this on the first solo album by Paul McCartney, which was, as you saw in one of the clips earlier, was recorded at EMI also at Abbey Road using the new recording console. It shows you without Paul McCartney, without the Beatles, he played a lot of drums, played a lot of guitar and whatnot. I like it. It's very punkish, like punk rock. So let's check out rather than me describing it words, let's see this solo here, and then we'll begin to wrap it up. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Some really, really nasty sounding guitars. I've never been able to, I told you I have dozens of pedals, but I've never been able to come close to getting any of those tones. I'm looking for the Holy Grail, right? The Beatles in a box in a pedal, but I don't know what Jeff Emmerich and George Martin and the Beatles themselves, what they did. I think the guitars went right into the consoles. I think they it's called DI, direct, right? They went directly into the board and then they processed it later. They overdrove it or something, but it's got some tones in there that are nice, and it works. And they put it together, and I'm sure they did it separately and they on their multi-track technology, and brought that puppy home. That was the end. And this is the end of today's talk too, right? And as you know, the last immortal couplet from I think it was from the hand of Paul McCartney says, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make." Think about that one. Does that hold true for you, for anybody, for the universe? I don't know, but that's what the album is there for, to pose these questions for us. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's been fun with you this last hour. I hope you'll share this talk with other people, and I hope you'll discuss this masterpiece of a record, an album, and with your friends and your family, and give it some more listenings and scrutiny, and keep reading and studying the Beatles. It's going to be, I can't imagine a future without new groups of people discovering a new generation, rediscovering them. So that's the definition of classic, right? And ladies and gentlemen, you are a classic, right? So subscribe and like this channel, and if you're so inclined, support me on Patreon, and we'll do a lot of other fun jam sessions here. We'll chop it up and nerd out on something else. There's a lot to appreciate in this beautiful wide world of ours. So thank you for joining me today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, what remains of it. And God willing, I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye.